The neon sign of the Sunset Diner flickered uncertainly against the endless black sky. From a distance, it was just another roadside stop on Highway 17, the kind of place truckers pulled into for strong coffee and teenagers sneaked into after prom for greasy fries. But for Mary Collins, it was the center of her existence, the only anchor she had left. It was past midnight, and the diner had that peculiar silence that comes when the last rush of customers has thinned and only the stragglers remain. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, throwing a harsh glow over the cracked vinyl booths. The air smelled of burnt bacon fat and the faint bitterness of coffee that had been sitting too long on the warmer. Mary adjusted her apron around her swelling belly, wincing slightly as the baby kicked against her ribs. 6 months along, 6 months of swollen feet, aching back, and the whispers of strangers. Her belly made her the subject of silent judgment. A young, unmarried waitress with no wedding ring. People didn't need to know her story to think they already did. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know how she had once believed in promises made under starlight, how the father of her child had sworn he'd stay. They didn't know how quickly he'd vanished when the pregnancy became real. Now Mary lived day to day, paycheck to paycheck. Tips from the counter kept the lights on in her tiny apartment and stocked a modest pantry. She could endure the exhaustion if it meant security for the baby growing inside her. What she couldn't endure was the gnawing memory that haunted her every shift. It had been 2 weeks ago. The night felt ordinary until they came in. A large man in a flannel shirt, the kind of man who carried an air of menace even in silence. And with him, a boy with blonde hair, maybe 9 or 10, skinny as a rail, his oversized sweatshirt hanging off his shoulders. Mary remembered the boy's eyes more than anything. Wide, frantic, darting to the door as if it were his only hope. When she asked what he'd like to drink, his voice quivered when he whispered, "Water." It was such a simple word, yet Mary had felt the weight behind it, the desperation. But before she could say more, the man's hand clamped firmly on the boy's shoulder. "He'll take a Coke," the man growled, sliding a few bills onto the table. The boy's mouth closed, his lips trembling as though he wanted to say something else, something he wasn't allowed to. Mary served them quietly, but her heart raced. She noticed the way the boy's sneakers tapped nervously beneath the booth, the way his small fingers toyed with the straw wrapper as if searching for courage. Then, just as quickly, they were gone. The man dragged the boy out the door, and the bell above the diner entrance jingled once before silence returned. Mary had stood there frozen, a pot of coffee in her hand, 1,000 questions in her mind, and not one word leaving her lips. She told herself it was nothing, that maybe it was a father and son who'd had an argument, but in her gut, she knew. She knew something was wrong. And then, last week, as she wiped down the counter with the television news humming in the background, she saw him again. Not in person, but on the screen. The same boy, his face pale in a school photograph, beneath the headline, "Missing, 10-year-old from Ohio disappears, possible abduction." Her breath had left her body in a rush. She nearly dropped the rag she was holding. Her hands shook so violently she had to grip the counter to stay upright. The boy wasn't from here. He wasn't local. And she had done nothing. Every night since, the memory ate at her. The guilt pressed down harder than her growing belly. She found herself staring at every truck that pulled into the diner lot, her heart racing at the sound of every child's laugh. She wanted to call the police, but what could she say? That she thought she saw a missing boy once, weeks ago? She was just a waitress. People didn't take her seriously. Tonight, as she refilled coffee cups and cleared half-empty plates, the weight of it all pressed on her more than ever. The baby kicked again, and she pressed a hand against her stomach, whispering softly, "It's going to be okay." But she didn't believe her own words. The bell over the door chimed. Mary looked up automatically. A man stepped in. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hair graying at the temples, and a leather jacket that had seen better days. He moved with a quiet presence, not hurried like most, not weary like the truckers. He chose the corner booth, the one tucked in shadows, away from the jukebox and the chatter of the counter. When she approached with a menu, he shook his head. "Just coffee. Black." His voice was low, steady, almost too calm. Mary poured the coffee, setting it before him, but she lingered a moment longer than usual. He didn't fidget or glance around like most strangers. He just sat there, staring at nothing in particular. And then she saw it. When he lifted the cup, his jacket sleeve shifted, revealing a glimpse of metal. Silver, worn smooth, but unmistakable. A badge. Mary's heart skipped. Law enforcement. Or at least someone who had been. She bit her lip, torn between fear and desperate hope. This was her chance. But could she take it? Mary stood at the counter for several minutes, pretending to rearrange napkin dispensers while her mind raced. If she said something and she was wrong, she'd look like a fool. Worse, she might attract the wrong kind of attention. But if she stayed silent, she might never forgive herself. She pulled out an order slip, her hand trembling as she wrote the words she had carried inside her for weeks. "I saw a missing boy here 2 weeks ago. He was with a man, driving a green truck. The plate had a 7 and J. Please believe me." Her chest tightened as she folded the paper and slipped it beneath the saucer. Then, gathering what little courage she had, she carried the coffee to the man's booth. She set it down, meeting his eyes for the briefest second. Then she turned away before her face could betray the storm of fear inside her. The man didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. But she knew he had read it, because when she risked one quick glance over her shoulder, he looked up at her with eyes sharp as glass. And then, slowly, he gave a single nod. That was it. A nod. But to Mary, it felt like the beginning of something far bigger than either of them. Thomas Grant had grown used to silence. Even now, seated in the dim corner of the diner, with a lukewarm cup of coffee before him, he embraced it. Silence had been his companion ever since retirement. After the noise of sirens, the shuffle of courtrooms, the endless drone of radio chatter. For 30 years, Grant had served as a federal agent with the Department of Justice, specializing in organized crime and trafficking cases. He had seen humanity at its worst, and in his retirement, he carried the weight of every face he had failed to save. The world, he believed, didn't stop being cruel just because he had hung up his badge. Which was why, despite his so-called retirement, he still followed the whispers, still tracked the threads of cases that others seemed too busy or too underfunded to pursue. The case of the missing Ohio boy had lodged itself deep in his conscience. He had first seen the child's face weeks ago on a bulletin, one of dozens flooding his inbox through his old contacts at the Bureau. Most cases faded into the blur of statistics, but something about this one had gnawed at him. A 10-year-old vanishing from a suburban backyard while playing catch with his dog. It was too clean, too surgical. Witnesses described a green pickup truck driving away from the neighborhood minutes later. The boy's parents had been frantic, pleading for help on television, but the trail had grown cold by the time the file reached Grant. A retired man with no official authority, he should have let it go. But Grant had spent his life hunting monsters who preyed on the vulnerable. He couldn't ignore the itch in his gut that told him this was connected to something bigger, something he had glimpsed during his last years in service, when trafficking rings began crossing state lines with increasing precision. And so he had followed rumors, chasing shadows from Ohio into Pennsylvania. He tracked movements of certain vehicles, cross-checked sightings, spoke quietly to contacts in truck stops and warehouses. Still, he lacked the one crucial piece: confirmation. Proof that this missing boy wasn't just a runaway, wasn't just another unsolved tragedy left to gather dust in a file cabinet. Until tonight, when the waitress set the coffee down in front of him, Grant had barely glanced up. But when his eyes caught the folded slip beneath the saucer, instinct flared. His fingers closed over it casually, shielding the motion from prying eyes, and he read the scrawled handwriting with growing intensity. "I saw a missing boy here 2 weeks ago. He was with a man, driving a green truck. The plate had a 7 and J. Please believe me." Grant's pulse, steady as a metronome in retirement, quickened. He lifted his eyes to the young woman hovering nearby, her face pale, her eyes darting away as though she had already regretted writing it. The baby bump pressing against her apron made the moment all the more striking. Here was someone who had every reason to protect herself, yet she had taken the risk to speak. He gave her the smallest of nods. It was all he could offer in the moment, but it carried meaning. He had received the message. Inside, however, his mind ignited. Grant didn't leave right away. He lingered, sipping the bitter coffee while watching the diner's remaining patrons filter out. A pair of truckers paid their bill. A tired-looking mother hustled her kids into the night, and eventually only he and the waitress remained. When he finally stood, dropping a few bills on the table, he caught her eye once more. She looked uncertain, as though unsure if he would do anything at all. Grant didn't speak. Words might put her at risk if the wrong ears were listening. But in his gut, he knew this wasn't just a lead. This was the break he had been waiting for. Outside, the night air was crisp, the highway stretching endlessly in both directions. Grant slid into his battered Ford sedan, started the engine, and pulled into the dark. His mind was already working, piecing together what he knew. A waitress in a diner 2 weeks ago saw a boy matching the description. A green truck, partial plate. It was more than he had gotten in months of chasing dead ends. He drove to the small motel where he had been staying and immediately unpacked his laptop, phone, and the worn leather folder that never left his side. Inside were photographs, maps, scribbled notes, and official memos leaked by sympathetic former colleagues. He cross-referenced the waitress's description against the vehicle logs he had already compiled. There it was, a green Ford F-150 registered in Pennsylvania, plates containing both a 7 and J, reported by a highway patrol unit weeks earlier for suspicious loitering near a rest area. The driver's name, unknown. The truck had been purchased under a false identity. Grant felt the rush of adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. He dialed a number from memory, one he had sworn he wouldn't use again after retirement. "Grant?" came the voice on the other end, gravelly with age. "I have a lead," Grant said. "Ohio boy, the one from the news. He's here. Or he was." There was a pause, followed by a sigh. "You're retired. You know how this looks." "I don't care how it looks. I'm telling you, I have a witness statement, a vehicle, and a match. This isn't some dead end. It's real." The voice softened. "All right, send me what you have. But Grant, if you're right, you just put yourself back in the middle of a firestorm." Grant hung up, sending the scanned note and his compiled evidence within minutes. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling of the cheap motel room. For years, he had chased shadows. Tonight, thanks to a frightened waitress with more courage than most, the shadows finally had shape. Meanwhile, back at the diner, Mary cleaned the last of the tables, unaware of the ripple she had just set into motion. She only knew that she had given her secret to a stranger, and with it, perhaps her last shred of hope.
The clock struck 5 a.m. when Thomas Grant closed his laptop and leaned back in the creaking chair of his motel room. His eyes burned from staring at records, cross-checking plates, and rereading the note written in a waitress's hurried scrawl. But fatigue didn't matter. For the first time in months, the pieces aligned. The waitress had been right. The boy wasn't just missing. He had been seen, alive in this very county. And the vehicle matched one of the shadow trucks Grant had been tracking along the interstate. Grant dialed another number. On the second ring, a weary voice answered, "Special Agent Daniels? It's Grant. I have movement." A pause. "You again? I thought you were done chasing ghosts." "I've got more than ghosts this time." Green Ford pickup, partial plate, 7J, confirmed sighting with a child matching the Ohio boy's description. Seen at a diner on Highway 17 2 weeks ago. Silence hummed over the line before Daniels spoke again, sharper this time. "You sure?" "I'm sure enough to bet my life on it," Grant replied. Daniels sighed. "All right. Stay put. I'll run it up. If this checks out, we move." Grant ended the call. Exhaling slowly, he had been dismissed before, labeled an old man with too much time and too many regrets. But now the Bureau would have no choice but to act. Across town, as the sun crept over the horizon, Mary shuffled into her small apartment. She dropped her keys onto the kitchen counter and leaned against it, exhausted. The apartment smelled faintly of dust and the stale leftovers she hadn't thrown out. She set her hand on her belly, whispering, "We made it through another night." But the moment of peace didn't last. Her thoughts spiraled back to the diner, to the man with the leather jacket, to the note she had dared to write. She wondered if he had already thrown it away, if he had dismissed her as some hormonal waitress chasing shadows. What if she had imagined it all? The boy's trembling eyes, the rough hand on his shoulder, the way he whispered water instead of Coke, it all felt so real. Yet, doubt clawed at her. Maybe it had just been a strict father. Maybe she had risked everything for nothing. She pulled out her phone and opened the news app, scrolling desperately. No updates, no breakthroughs, just the same headline from last week. Search continues for missing. Ohio boy, family pleads for help. Mary closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek. God, if I was right, please let someone believe me. Grant didn't sleep. By afternoon, he was behind the wheel again, shadowing leads. The Bureau had traced the suspicious truck to an industrial zone on the outskirts of town, where half-abandoned warehouses dotted the cracked asphalt. It was the perfect hiding place for men who thrived in shadows. He parked his sedan at a distance, binoculars in hand. Through the dirty glass, he watched as the green Ford pickup rolled into the warehouse lot. A man climbed out. Broad shoulders, flannel shirt, the kind that matched Mary's description without her even knowing she'd given one. And then Grant's chest tightened. A small figure was pulled from the passenger side, a child. The boy's head was down, hair falling into his face. But even from here, Grant recognized the size, the posture. It was him. He raised his phone immediately. "Daniels, I've got eyes. Warehouse near Mill Creek. They've got him. We don't have time to waste." "Copy that," Daniels replied, his tone all business now. "We'll mobilize. Stay in position." Grant lowered the phone, heart pounding. He had been right. Mary had been right. And now, every second mattered. Meanwhile, Mary tried to distract herself with small routines, washing dishes, folding laundry, making a simple meal of scrambled eggs she barely touched. But the unease only grew. She jumped at every knock at the door, every footstep in the hallway outside her apartment. What if someone had seen her write the note? What if she had drawn attention to herself? Her phone buzzed with a text from her landlord reminding her about rent. Another reminder that she was on her own, her life fragile, precarious. Yet she kept thinking of the boy, his wide eyes, his unspoken plea. Maybe, just maybe, that silent man in the corner booth would do something with what she had given him. By nightfall, federal agents in unmarked vehicles had surrounded the industrial park. Through headsets and whispered commands, they prepared for the raid. Grant, though officially retired, had been allowed to observe from the perimeter. He gripped the steering wheel of his car tightly, watching the warehouse where faint lights flickered inside. He thought of Mary again, the courage it took for her to risk everything on a scrap of paper. Ordinary people rarely acted. They saw, they doubted, they looked away. but not her. If this operation succeeded, it would be because a pregnant waitress had found the strength to do what others would not. The night was unnervingly still, the kind of stillness that made every sound feel magnified. The rustle of leaves, the hum of distant traffic, the metallic click of a rifle bolt being checked one final time. From his vantage point behind the wheel of his car, Thomas Grant could see the warehouse looming against the dark horizon. Its corrugated metal siding was rusted, the windows long since shattered, patched with plywood. To an unknowing eye, it was just another abandoned building in a forgotten industrial park. But Grant knew better. Monsters often chose places no one cared about. Through his binoculars, he tracked faint movements near the entrance. Shadows shifting, men stepping in and out, cigarettes glowing briefly in the dark before being stubbed out. And then, the smallest detail of all, the flicker of a light deeper inside, as if illuminating something they wanted hidden. Grant's chest tightened. He remembered the boy's photograph. Blonde hair, shy smile, a baseball cap tilted too big for his head. If that boy was inside, if even one child was inside, there was no time to waste. The radio crackled softly beside him. Alpha team in position. Bravo team ready. Breach in 2 minutes. Grant swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't officially part of this anymore. He had no vest, no rifle, no clearance, but his hands gripped the steering wheel as if he could hold back fate itself. He hated being on the outside. He had lived for moments like this, and now all he could do was watch. 2 minutes stretched like eternity. He thought of Mary, the waitress whose trembling handwriting had put this all in motion. Did she know the weight of what she had done? Did she know that children's lives now hinged on her courage? "Go!" a voice snapped over the radio. The night erupted. Dark figures moved swiftly, silently, until the first battering ram slammed against the steel doors. The sound thundered through the lot like a cannon. Shouts echoed. "Federal agents, don't move!" as flashlights and laser sights cut through the dark. Gunfire cracked in response, short and chaotic. Grant's heart lurched as he heard the exchange, the sharp barks of pistols against the disciplined bursts of rifles. He clenched his jaw, watching the chaos unfold in shadows and strobe lights. Then came the cries. High-pitched, frantic. Children. Grant's stomach dropped. He shoved open his car door and moved closer, staying low behind another vehicle. He had no weapon, no armor, but every instinct screamed at him to go inside. Inside the warehouse, the scene was hellish. Crates overturned, men scrambling to destroy evidence, a half-dozen suspects tackled to the ground by armed agents, and in the far corner, behind a chain-link cage, crudely fashioned into a pen, clustered at least 7 children. Their faces were pale, hollowed by fear, their clothes ragged. One boy clung to the bars, his eyes wide and wet. Blonde hair fell across his forehead. Grant's breath caught. It was him. The boy from the news. The boy Mary had seen. "Get the kids out," an agent shouted, cutting the lock with heavy bolt cutters. The gate swung open, and the children stumbled into waiting arms. Some screamed, others simply collapsed in silence, too stunned to cry. Grant stepped forward, the sight blurring his vision. He wanted to reach for them, to tell them they were safe now. Instead, he stayed back, letting the trained medics and officers do their jobs. His chest ached with a mixture of relief and fury, relief that they were alive, fury that anyone had dared to cage them like animals. The blonde boy looked around wildly, as if searching for someone. For a terrifying moment, Grant thought he might be looking for the man who had taken him. Some twisted bond of fear and control. But then the boy's eyes landed on an officer kneeling to his level, holding out a blanket. The boy hesitated only a second before stepping into the man's arms, clutching the blanket as if it were a lifeline. Grant exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. By the time the shooting stopped, 6 men were in custody, dragged out in handcuffs, their faces pressed into the dirt. Agents swarmed the warehouse, securing evidence, photographing everything. Trucks, ledgers, cell phones, all of it would become part of a case that stretched far beyond Pennsylvania. But none of that mattered to Grant, as much as the sight of those children being led into vans where paramedics waited. He caught one last glimpse of the blonde boy, his face half buried in the blanket, before the doors closed. Grant turned away, pressing his palms to his eyes. The weight of years seemed to lift from his shoulders, if only a little. He had seen too many cases end in body bags. Tonight, at least, some would end in reunions. Hours later, long after the last suspect had been loaded into a squad car, Grant stood beside Agent Daniels near the edge of the lot. "You were right," Daniels admitted, his voice gruff. "Wouldn't have moved without your lead. Wouldn't have had the lead without her." Grant nodded. "The waitress. She trusted me. She could have stayed quiet, but she didn't." Daniels gave him a long look. "Ordinary people don't usually change cases like this." "Sometimes," Grant said softly, "it takes someone ordinary to do something extraordinary." Meanwhile, across town, Mary lay awake in her bed. She couldn't shake the unease. Every creak of the old apartment building made her sit up, heart racing. She pressed her hand against her belly, whispering softly, "We're okay. We're safe." She didn't know that, at that very moment, a convoy of vans carrying rescued children was racing towards safety. She didn't know that her note had already saved lives. All she knew was that she had spoken the truth once, and she prayed it had mattered. Morning came with a pale grey light that crept reluctantly through the blinds of Mary's small apartment. She had hardly slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the boy again. Thin shoulders hunched, lips trembling, whispering water. Sometimes she woke with a start, certain she had heard a knock at the door or footsteps outside. But it was always just silence. The hum of the old refrigerator, the creak of pipes in the walls. When her alarm buzzed at 7 a.m., she forced herself up, exhaustion pulling at her like lead weights. The diner didn't care if she'd had a restless night. Bills didn't care. Her unborn child didn't care. She splashed cold water on her face, tied her hair back, and slipped into her faded uniform, adjusting the apron around her belly. At the diner, the world went on as if nothing had changed. The neon sign flickered open, coffee dripped into the pot, and regulars filled the booths with the usual chatter. Mary moved between them quietly, pouring coffee, balancing plates, forcing a smile that never quite reached her eyes. But inside, her heart still wrestled with fear and doubt. She thought of the man in the leather jacket, the stranger who had read her note and given only a nod. Had he done anything with it? Had it meant something? Or had he tossed it away, dismissing her as some frightened waitress imagining things? By mid-morning, her doubts felt unbearable. As she wiped down the counter, she glanced up at the small television mounted above the register. It usually played local news, though few customers ever paid attention. Today, the screen blazed with bold letters, FBI raid in Pennsylvania, children rescued from trafficking ring. Mary froze, the rag slipping from her hand. She turned up the volume, her heart hammering. The reporter's voice filled the diner. Authorities confirm that multiple children were rescued late last night in a raid on an abandoned warehouse. 6 suspects are now in custody. Among those rescued is 10-year-old Jacob Miller. Reported missing from Ohio 3 weeks ago, Mary's knees went weak. She grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself. Jacob Miller, the boy she had seen. A wave of relief surged through her chest, chased immediately by tears she tried to blink away before anyone noticed. But the emotions came too quickly. Relief, guilt, joy, disbelief, all tangled into something overwhelming. She ducked into the back kitchen for a moment, pressing her hands to her face, whispering, "Oh my God, thank you." When she returned to the front, 3 men had entered the diner. They stood just inside the door, scanning the room. One wore a suit, the second carried a briefcase, and the third, her breath caught. It was him, the silent man, the one from last night, the one who had read her note. Mary's pulse roared in her ears. She gripped her order pad too tightly, forcing herself to walk forward. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man shook his head gently. This time, he spoke. "Mary Collins?" She froze. "Yes." The man's eyes softened. "My name is Thomas Grant." He glanced at the agents beside him. "These are federal officers. We wanted to thank you." Mary's mouth went dry. "Thank me? For what?" One of the agents placed a photograph on the counter. It showed a cluster of children wrapped in blankets, sitting inside a van. Their faces were tired, but safe. Alive, among them, Jacob. Mary pressed a hand to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. "He's safe?" she whispered. Grant nodded. "He's safe. Because of you." Her knees nearly gave out, and she sank onto a stool, staring at the photo. She could hardly breathe. She had imagined this moment so many times in her nightmares, seeing Jacob's face again. But not like this. Never alive, never saved. I almost didn't write it," she admitted in a broken whisper. "I thought no one would believe me. I thought I was crazy." Grant leaned closer, his voice low but firm. "You weren't crazy. You were brave. That note gave us the break we needed. Without it, we might not have found them in time." Mary's tears spilled freely now. She wiped them with the back of her hand, laughing shakily. "I'm just a waitress." Grant shook his head. "Last night, you weren't just a waitress. You were the one person who chose to act when everyone else looked away." For the rest of the day, Mary moved through the diner in a daze. Every sound felt distant, every order automatic. But inside her heart carried something new. Not just relief, not just pride, something steadier. A quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. When her shift ended, she walked home slowly, the photo the agents had left tucked into her apron pocket. Once in her apartment, she sat on the sofa, pulled it out, and studied it in the dim afternoon light. The children's faces stared back at her. Fragile, exhausted, but safe. She thought of her own child stirring within her, the future uncertain, but suddenly less frightening. She pressed the photo against her belly and whispered, "One day, I'll tell you this story. How we were part of something bigger. How even a scrap of paper can change the world." The diner was unusually quiet the next morning. The usual crowd of truckers and regulars had been replaced by silence, broken only by the hum of the coffee machine. Mary stood behind the counter, absent-mindedly drying mugs, her thoughts drifting back to the photograph still tucked safely in her purse. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw their faces. The children huddled in blankets, exhaustion etched deep into their eyes, yet alive. And she had played a part in that, but the disbelief lingered. How could someone like her, a single waitress, barely keeping her life together, have shifted the course of something so vast, so dangerous? She had wanted to ask Grant more, to demand proof that it wasn't just coincidence. But the way he had looked at her yesterday, the weight in his voice when he said, "Because of you, it had been enough." She thought of telling someone, her landlord, the cashier at the grocery store, even one of the regulars who always tipped just a quarter. But the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain? And would they even believe her? Ordinary people didn't get to be heroes. The bell above the diner door jingled. Mary looked up, expecting another customer. Instead, Thomas Grant walked in. He looked different in daylight, less like a shadow, more like a man carrying years of weariness in his eyes. His leather jacket hung from his shoulders, and his grey hair caught the morning sun filtering through the blinds. "You came back?" Mary said, her voice quiet. Grant gave a faint smile. "I told myself I wouldn't, but..." He trailed off, scanning the nearly empty diner before taking a seat on the counter. "Coffee? Black?" Mary poured him a cup, sliding it across with steadier hands this time. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "If anything, I owe you. That note. You didn't just give us a lead, you gave us time. And time is the one thing we never have enough of in these cases." Mary hesitated. "The boy, Jacob, is he really okay?" Grant nodded. "He's with his family. Shaken but alive, the others too. It'll take years to heal what was done to them, but at least they'll have that chance." Mary exhaled, relief flooding her chest again. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy, but in a way that carried meaning. Finally, Grant reached into his jacket and slid something across the counter. It was the order slip, the same scrap of paper she had written on 2 nights ago. The handwriting was hers, shaky and rushed. "They wanted this for the case file," he said. "Evidence. But I kept a copy. I thought you should have the original." Mary stared at it, tears pricking her eyes. That crumpled scrap looked so small, so ordinary, yet it had changed everything. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket. "For when my child grows up," she whispered, "I want them to know their mother did something that mattered." Grant's gaze softened. "Then keep it safe." They talked a little longer, about nothing and everything, about how ordinary life had to keep going, even after extraordinary nights, about how Mary still had bills to pay, still had dishes to wash, still had a baby on the way, and then Grant stood to leave. "Take care of yourself, Mary." She gave him a wavering smile. "And you." As the door closed behind him, Mary felt a pang of finality, as though she had just closed the last page of a chapter she hadn't even realized she was writing. That evening, as twilight stretched across the small town, Mary returned to her apartment. She pulled out the order slip again, smoothing it against her palm. She wanted to tuck it into a drawer, maybe pin it inside a book, but something made her pause. She looked at the worn piece of paper, then at her unborn child's ultrasound pinned to the refrigerator. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where her child might be proud of her. She placed the slip gently into a shoebox filled with baby clothes she had been saving. Tiny socks, a blanket, a stuffed bear. It didn't look like much, but to her, it was a legacy. 2 weeks later, the diner was crowded again. The story of the raid had spread across the country, though Mary's name had never been mentioned. People talked about brave federal agents and excellent police work. Mary smiled quietly as she refilled mugs, never correcting them. But one afternoon, a family walked in. A couple in their 30s, the woman clutching the hand of a blonde boy. Mary froze, the coffee pot trembling in her hand. The boy, Jacob. He looked healthier now, dressed in clean clothes, but his eyes still carried the shadows of fear. As they settled into a booth, he glanced up, and their eyes met. Recognition flickered. Slowly, Jacob slid from the booth, walked toward the counter, and stopped in front of her. He didn't say anything. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket. A folded note. He placed it on the counter. Mary's throat closed as she unfolded it. The handwriting was childlike, shaky. "Thank you for seeing me." Tears blurred her vision. She knelt down so they were eye to eye, her hand covering his. "I'll never forget you," she whispered. Jacob gave a small nod, then returned to his parents' side. Mary pressed the note to her chest, sobbing quietly. For all the judgment, for all the loneliness, for all the nights of doubt, this moment was enough. Her child kicked inside her belly, as if echoing the truth she now knew. Even the smallest act, even a scrap of paper, could ripple outward and change lives. As the diner door jingled and the family left, Mary looked around at the ordinary world, moving on. Customers eating pie, coffee brewing, dishes clattering. Nothing had changed, and yet, for her, everything had. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the woman who had chosen to act, the woman whose note had saved children. And though the world would never know her name, one boy did. And one day, her child would too.